I really appreciate that warm introduction and warm reception. As Secretary of Defense, of course, I'm not involved in politics anymore. So I don't have the opportunity to go out and participate in events where people actually talk about Republicans and conservatives and some of those other phrases. But I used to be involved in politics in the old days. And I always like to tell the story about my last campaign. That it was my 6th time running for office. You know, when you run for office as often as I did, you do all those rallies and barbecues and all the door-to-door work, your pictures on television, names in the newspaper, you assume everybody knows who you are. We had a tradition in Wyoming. We always started the political campaign every year down in the little farming community along the Nebraska border, town of Torrington, where the farm groups would invite all the candidates, Republican and Democrat alike, out to come talk to the folks, tell them what you do for them if you got elected. And my last campaign, before it was my turn to get up and speak, I wanted to get around and make certain I'd personally greeted every voter in the crowd. Walked up to one old cowboy with his back up against a tree, cowboy hat pulled down over his eyes, reached out and grabbed him by the hand and said, "Hi, I'm Dick Cheney. I'm running for Congress and I'd like your vote." He said, "You've got it. That fool we got in there now is no damn good." So there's some things about politics I don't miss. Well, it is a very special pleasure to be here tonight on a very important occasion in terms of the annual dinner, the John Ashbrook Center. I had the rare privilege of serving, along with my colleague Phil Crane, with John Ashbrook in the House of Representatives. I was a very junior and lowly freshman member of the House at the time, but he was a man of sterling qualities who always knew exactly what he believed in. He was a real leader for all of those principles and values that we now see sweeping the world. I can't think of anyone who would be more pleased with the events of the last few weeks and the last 2 years than would be John Ashbrook. And it's a special privilege, Cliff, for you to have invited me to be here tonight and to share this with all of you. I also am privileged to be here tonight with the troops of the 1486th. You know, every place I go around the country, people say nice things about the war in the Gulf, but I like to remind them that the men and women that we sent performed so magnificently that they made all the rest of us look good. And it has been one of the very special honors for me, serving as Secretary of Defense, to be associated with all of them. A final point, while I'm doing commercials tonight, before I get into substance of the speech, I think, having watched events on television the last 2 days, that it would be an excellent idea if the United States Senate would confirm Judge Clarence Thomas to the United States Supreme Court. I don't have a vote, but they give me advice about how I should do my job, and I should be able to give them some advice about how the Senate should perform its job. Well, I'd like to spend some time with you tonight talking about some of the developments of recent weeks and months. Like all Americans, I've been enthralled with the developments that have occurred inside the Soviet Union. I'm torn often as I think back on those days of just 3 weeks ago over which image I'm most attracted to, whether it's the act of Boris Yeltsin standing on top of a tank outside the Russian parliament facing down the old guard, old-line communist in the Kremlin, or whether it was the act of the people of Moscow tearing down the statue of the founder of the KGB in front of KGB headquarters. I'm delighted to note that apparently now they've decided they're finally going to bury Lenin. The changes have truly been phenomenal, and for us to watch in our lifetimes the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, the banishment, if you will, of the instruments of oppression that have served to so harshly repress the people of the Soviet Union and to create a threat to the freedoms of all the rest of us in the world now for 70-some years is truly a historic and momentous occasion. But I think it's extremely important that we not lose sight of the enormous difficulties that lie ahead in the Soviet Union in wake of the euphoria of having witnessed the recent events. I believe that if John Ashbrook were here tonight, he would warn all of us as well to be very cautious and very prudent in terms of our expectations about what lies ahead. It takes absolutely nothing away from the tremendous accomplishment of the Russian people or the defense of democracy or their willingness to take on the coup plotters to say that there is enormous uncertainty about what the future has in store for what used to be the Soviet Union in the months and years immediately ahead. There are a large number of questions to be asked about what will transpire next, questions that at this point have no answer. We do not know whether or not the course of development in the Soviet Union in the months and years ahead will be peaceful, or whether it will be interrupted periodically by violence. We don't know when their economy will stop collapsing. We do know it will continue to collapse for a while longer. We don't know whether or not there'll be large refugee flows out of the Soviet Union that threaten the stability and security of their neighboring states. We don't know how large their military will be or who will control it, whether it'll be controlled from the center or by independent republics. And while we're confident of current arrangements, we have no idea who will control some 30,000 nuclear weapons currently in the Soviet inventory 3 to 5 years from now. We have, I think, high hopes and expectations for developments in the Soviet Union in the period immediately ahead. Presidents made it abundantly clear that we're eager to support their efforts to move towards true democracy, towards economic reform, towards demilitarization of their society, and reduce the enormous burden the military has placed on their society for all of these years, and to see the Soviet Union, or what replaces it, become a true voluntary association of sovereign states joined together of their own free will. All of those are worthy goals and objectives that we, I think, hold for the people of the Soviet Union. But the bottom line is that we are faced with uncertainty about what happens next. Some of my friends on Capitol Hill have responded, as they always do, to any change in the international environment. Cut the defense budget. That's the cry this week. Now that communism's collapsed inside the Soviet Union, we're in a position where obviously we no longer need to maintain military strength in the United States. I think that would be a very, very serious mistake. I think those who spend time advocating that course of action forget how it is we won the Cold War. And we did indeed win the Cold War. Our success at confronting what came to be the world's largest military buildup, and the use of that military power from time to time to oppress not only the people of the Soviet Union, but the people of Eastern Europe, the captive nations, the Baltic states, Afghanistan, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and to threaten the security of nations all over the world, in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. Our success in confronting that power is one of the reasons why we are all able tonight to enjoy the enormous success of the events that we've just witnessed. I had the experience, shortly after I became Secretary of Defense, of entertaining in my office in the Pentagon a young man in his early 30s who had just been elected to the Congress of People's Deputies in Moscow. He was I would describe a strong pro-democracy, anti-communist reformer in the Soviet mold. Mr. Sakharov, who had, of course, been one of the leading resistors to communism in the Soviet Union, had actually stepped aside so this young man could occupy a particular seat in the Congress of People's Deputies. And after we discussed events in the Soviet Union and he got ready to leave, I asked him where he was going. He said he was going to California to see and to thank the father of perestroika. I said, what do you mean you're going to California to thank the father of perestroika? He said, well, I'm off to see former President Reagan. And it was his belief, while he was willing to give credit to Mr. Gorbachev for his leadership in the early days of the changes in the Soviet Union and his willingness and his recognition of the need for changes in Soviet policies, he believed firmly that it was indeed the policies of the United States, policies of military strength and determination, of support for our values, our belief in freedom, and our willingness to back up our commitments worldwide with the deployment of significant military forces that had indeed precipitated the necessity for the Soviet Union to dramatically alter the policies that they pursued throughout the period of the Cold War. He believed Ronald Reagan was the father of perestroika. It's very, very important that we not forget that lesson in this period of euphoria as we enjoy and bask with the rest of the world in the enormous changes that have occurred in the Soviet Union over the course of the last few weeks. Another key reason for us not to radically reduce the defense budget at this point is that we've already got major fundamental changes underway in U.S. national security policy. Changes that are embodied in the revised strategy that the President's directed over the last 2 years are more fundamental than anything we've seen in the last 45. You have to go back to the beginning of the Cold War to find a time when the fundamental underlying assumptions of our strategic posture have been changed so dramatically. We've moved from a posture in which we believed we needed to maintain large military forces capable of dealing with a Soviet-led Warsaw Pact attack into Western Europe on short notice to one in which our prime focus are regional contingencies, the kind of contingency and conflict we just prevailed in Southwest Asia. It is a fundamental change in terms of how we size our forces, in terms of how large our forces need to be and how ready they need to be. Our operating assumption in the future is that before we would again face the kind of threat that we've dealt with in Europe now for 40-some years, we would have time to reconstitute forces to deal with that kind of threat. Accompanying this change in our basic fundamental strategy, of course, are big changes in our defense budget. During the period of time that I've been Secretary of Defense, since March of 1989, just some 2.5 years ago, we have reduced our long-range defense budget by more than $250 billion. If you look at the level of spending that we anticipate, if our program is ultimately approved by the Congress and adhered to by the mid-90s, we'll be spending only 18% of the federal budget on defense. That'll be the lowest level of defense spending since before Pearl Harbor. If you measure it against our gross national product, it'll be under 4%, about 3.6%, again, the lowest level of defense spending measured by that standard since the 1930s. The good news is we can do that because of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet withdrawal from Europe, and the changes that have occurred in the world over the last few years. The bad news is that each time previously when we've been through one of these cycles where we've significantly reduced the size of U.S. military forces, we've blown it. We've never, ever done it right. Just in the 20th century alone, there have been 4 major reductions in U.S. military force, whether we talk about 1919 after World War I, or the period immediately after World War II, 1945, or the period after Korea or Vietnam. Now, each time it was a dramatically different set of circumstances than we're faced with today. Each time we were reducing a large conscript army, but each time we ended up doing serious damage to U.S. military capability, damage that could only be repaired after years of effort and a major investment of resources. I remind everyone of what happened in the 5 short years between summer of 1945, when the United States had completed enormous victory in World War II, and the summer of 1950, just 5 years later, when we were barely able to hang on in South Korea when faced with aggression by the North Koreans. If we are going to avoid that kind of disaster this time around, if we're going to be wise enough to make the kinds of cuts that are required but preserve the quality of the force, then it's absolutely essential that we have the courage and the wisdom to make the tough decisions that are necessary. It's absolutely essential that we close outmoded and unnecessary and unneeded bases. If the United States Army is going to have only 12 active divisions instead of 18, and it will, I don't need as many Army bases as would have been the case before. If the United States Air Force is going to have 28% fewer aircraft, fewer wings than we've had previously, we don't need as many air bases. We need to shut down production lines and producing equipment that is no longer required or which we have a sufficient number of in order to focus our resources investing in new technologies and new capabilities for the future. It's absolutely essential, among other things, that we invest in strategic defense initiative, that we move forward now to build and deploy the kinds of defenses that will guarantee that in the future we can defend U.S. forces overseas and our friends overseas and the continental United States from the threat of ballistic missile attack. That message still hasn't gotten through sufficiently to all of my friends up on Capitol Hill. One of the key things that must be emphasized when we talk about the kinds of decisions that we're faced with now and the kinds of changes that are underway in the United States military is the problem of timelines, a recognition that it takes a very long time to build quality military forces. During the course of the war in the Persian Gulf, we deployed 6 aircraft carriers. Half of those were more than 20 years old. The F-111 bomber that did such a tremendous job of dropping precision weapons on Iraqi targets that we all watched with great interest on videotape, that F-111 bomber was first operational in 1967, 24 years ago. The newest system we had, the newest platform, of course, was the F-117, and it got its start some 9 years ago. And if we look at the length of time that it takes to train first-rate, top-notch military personnel, a man like Freddie Franks, commander of the 7th Corps, who conducted that tremendous flanking movement into southern Iraq, was a work of more than 30 years before a man is qualified to command a modern armored division in combat. The fact is that it takes an enormous amount of time for us to be able to develop and field the kinds of forces that we just did. It's simply not possible for us to do it overnight or to change it on short notice. When we talk about preserving the quality force, making certain that we keep the essence of the tremendous forces that we all watched perform so magnificently in the Persian Gulf, it's absolutely vital that we maintain those elements that produced for us that victory. I'm reminded as we think about what kinds of forces we want to preserve in the future, and as we start through this process of downsizing the force, that we have the courage to get rid of those things we cannot afford and no longer need in order to protect what's important. One of the things that's absolutely important, of course, is our ability to recruit first-class people to serve, people like you've seen here tonight, who serve in the Guard and Reserve and on active duty. Today, we've got an all-volunteer force. There was no one serving in the Gulf who didn't volunteer to wear the uniform of the United States military. But they've got options. They are so good, so qualified, so capable that they can find other things to do with their time and their careers. For us to be able to continue to attract and retain those kinds of people means that we've got to be prepared in the future to support them and to give them the kind of training and the kind of equipment they need. Shortly after the war in Iraq was over with, I had the privilege of visiting with the 3rd Armored Division in southern Iraq. I thought it was appropriate that I get into southern Iraq and spend a little bit of time with the troops, watching and talking with them about the activities that they'd been engaged in. And the troops of the 3rd Armored Division battalion commander took me out over the battlefield and showed me where the 3rd Armored Division had in fact encountered large elements of the Republican Guard and destroyed them. During the course of the conflict, we destroyed some 3,800 Iraqi tanks. We lost 18 of our own. That kind of result is a product not only of quality personnel and first-class equipment, but most especially it is the result of training, of absolutely first-class training. I asked that day when I was out there in the Iraqi desert with the 3rd Armored Division, I asked the troops how many of them had had the opportunity to go through our National Training Center out at Fort Irwin in California, where we put our armored formations through the closest thing we can to actual combat. Nearly every member of the battalion had been through the National Training Center at Fort Irwin. One senior sergeant had been there 6 times. I asked them what they thought of the training. The sergeant replied that it was tougher than anything they ran into in Iraq. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. The training is supposed to be so good in peacetime that when it comes time to actually engage in combat, that we achieve the kinds of results we did in Iraq. I like to tell the story of the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing at Langley, Virginia. Last August, when President Bush directed us to deploy forces to Saudi Arabia after the Saudis had agreed to accept them, the first unit that was moved was the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing from Langley. In 14 hours, from the time they left the field in Virginia, in 14 hours they were on the ground in Saudi Arabia ready to go. Now that same unit, the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing, 10 years ago flunked its operational readiness exam. Out of the 72 aircraft in the wing, only 27 were flyable. The rest were grounded for lack of spare parts. If we make a series of decisions over the course of the next few years about reshaping U.S. military power and U.S. military capability that produces that kind of result in the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing, or that denies the men of the 3rd Armored Division or all of the other units that participated in the conflict the kind of training they require to do the kind of job they did for us, then we'll be back in the kind of hollow force that we had in the late 1970s that was overcome only with major effort by a great many people. I am continually reminded at the Department of Defense that we have only one mission. I was told this shortly after I was confirmed as Secretary by a man who had served with distinction in the United States Marine Corps in World War II and then again in Korea. He said, Dick, you've got to remember that there is only one job, one assignment, one responsibility you have as Secretary of Defense. That's to make absolutely certain that we are prepared to fight, and if we have to fight, absolutely certain that we can win. There is no other purpose for having a Department of Defense or a United States military, and that's your job. And he was absolutely right. I am absolutely confident, as we meet here tonight, that I can say with certainty that there will come another time when an American president will find it necessary to send young Americans into combat. Everything we do now, every decision we make, whether we respond to the temporary cries urging more drastic cuts in the defense budget, or whether we make wrong decisions and keep open bases we don't need and force structure we're not prepared to support, every single one of those kinds of decisions will have a bearing upon the next war. Every decision we make as we go through the debate that's currently raging on Capitol Hill in terms of U.S. military capability is tied directly to the question of the next time we go, will we be able to accomplish our mission? And what will be the cost in terms of American lives? Every time I return to Washington from one of my trips on the road, like tonight, my plane lands out at Andrews Air Force Base outside the city. I get on a helicopter and fly into Washington to the Pentagon. As I fly in across the city, I come down the Anacostia River and look down on the Capitol building, the great monuments of the city, Capitol building where all of the debates have taken place for some 200 years of our history, the White House, the Washington Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, and the Lincoln Monument. And we cross over the Potomac, and just before the helicopter lands on the helipad at the Pentagon, I look down on Arlington National Cemetery. Every time I make that trip, I'm reminded of how enormously fortunate we all are to be Americans, and what a terrible price a lot of very brave men paid to make that possible. Thank you very much. Press corps to do that in Washington. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. We came out to participate this evening in the annual Ashbrook Center event. John was a friend of mine from my time in the House of Representatives. I was a very junior member when he was there before he left, but I always had great respect and admiration for him. I'm delighted to be here today to participate in that event. When I get out like this, I like to have press briefings and press conferences. I don't come with any prepared message I'll give out later on tonight, but I'd be happy to respond to any questions or comments anyone has.
Mr. Secretary, in regards to the moves with Cuba this morning, is that part of a renewed effort to isolate Castro? Are you prepared to make more moves to isolate him now that we seem to be the last superpower?
In terms of the Soviet withdrawal? Yeah. I haven't seen the details yet, just present count. President Gorbachev supposedly announced that they're preparing to pull their forces out of Cuba. I think that's very positive news. I think that's great. I think it is one more indication of the kind of phenomenal changes we've seen over the last couple of years. Perhaps it will even be possible to have a breath of freedom in Cuba. Having the Soviets withdraw, I think, is an indication that Fidel Castro has kept himself in power all these years by brute force that his own days may remember.
Cheney. My name is Chris Lawson from WDOL Radio in Elyria. First, I'd like to tell you that it's really nice for me to meet another alumnus from the University of Wyoming.
Great school.
And I'd like to ask you, given the fact that the American troops blasted Iraq and the Gulf, do you still have any regrets during that time?
About the Gulf War?
About the Gulf War.
In what respect?
I'd like you to respond to the casualties on the American side.
Well, we were obviously thankful that the cost in terms of American lives was no higher than it was. But for the 148 of our people who were killed in action, for their families, obviously, it was not a low-cost war. Always regret the loss of life that's involved in a military operation. But I think when you keep in mind the fact that we destroyed 2/3 of the world's fourth largest army, liberated Kuwait, took on one of the world's best equipped military forces, and were able to achieve our objectives with relatively low cost in terms of casualties. That speaks to the dedication and professionalism of America's armed forces. I wish that Saddam Hussein had, first of all, never invaded Kuwait. Secondly, that he had withdrawn his forces from the Gable had the opportunity to do so for some 5 months prior to the start of the air war. And then after the air war started, when we again gave him numerous opportunities to get out before the ground campaign was launched. And he chose not to do that. He left us with no option other than to use military force. And it's unfortunate whenever that happens, but I am obviously pleased, as I think the entire country was, and the entire world amazed at the confidence and capability of our forces to do that.
Mr. Secretary, I'm Keith Ashbrook from U.S. Army Recruiting at Public Affairs Publications. Mr. Secretary, concern among our military readers is the future of military recruiting as we go into force reductions. In light of a high-quality force that was recruited for Operation Desert Storm, what will the Defense Department's priorities be for military recruiting as we go further into the 90s?
We will continue to place a heavy emphasis on recruiting. I've been pleased to see the preliminary numbers that we're getting now in the period after the War of the Gulf. We appear to be at an all-time high in terms of the accomplishments, the capabilities, the number of recruits to high school diplomas, close to 99% of the services. And that's a very positive development from the standpoint of the military. We will continue to operate with an all-volunteer force in the future, just as we have for the last 18 years. As we've shown that we can make it work, and it produces probably the finest quality force we've ever had. We're going to have a smaller force, but if it's going to be capable of doing everything that it has to do, there can't be any question about the importance of maintaining the quality of the force. And that goes to such issues as the kinds of people we're able to recruit to serve, the kinds of training we provide them, the kind of equipment they have. It still is going to be, even if we have a smaller force, still going to be a prime objective to preserve the quality. That means, for example, that we want to continue to advertise. One of the questions that comes up with recruiting when cutting the size of the force is, well, why don't you quit advertising? That way you can save money and you're still going to get all the recruits you need. It's not strictly a question of quantity. The folks that we are most eager to attract are the ones who've got choices. We've got other options. And the recruiting dollar basically gets spent in order to attract those young men and women who've got other opportunities other than military service. The best and the brightest. Those are the ones we want. Those are the ones that we need, that we're now getting. They're the ones who serve in the Gulf, and we need to be able to maintain that standard in the years ahead.
Secretary Cheney, David Christopher, Channel 5, Cleveland. In light of the recent developments in the Soviet Union, what are your feelings about nuclear security regarding the Soviet Union? When Gorbachev was involved in the coup, there was talk about the nuclear weapons and the nuclear box. Who was in control? What are your feelings today about the security of the weapons?
The Soviets have gone out of their way to emphasize in all of their discussions with us before the coup and since the coup, that they understand that they've got special responsibilities as a nuclear power. That responsibility includes maintaining the safety and reliability of their systems and maintaining tight control. over those nuclear weapons. When I was in the Soviet Union last October, then Marshal Yazov, who was my counterpart, the Soviet defense minister, went out of his way to emphasize how strongly they felt about that and they took those responsibilities very seriously. Even then, they were moving some weapons out of areas where there had been domestic unrest. Of course, Marshal Yazov was one of the coup plotters. He no longer has anything to say about control over Soviet nuclear weapons. But his replacement, General Shapashnikov, has made similar statements. We have no reason at this point to be concerned about the safety and security of those systems during the coup. They gave every indication in terms of the way they conducted themselves and the readiness levels that they maintained with their forces during the few days of the coup, that there was never any danger of unauthorized personnel getting control. But it's also important to keep in mind that for a few days there, it looked as though the coup plotters would succeed, and that the communist old guard, the traditionalists, if you will, would in fact, just as they would have controlled everything else in the Soviet Union, would have also been in control of their nuclear forces. The real question has to do with what happens in the future. We simply don't know what kind of arrangements they eventually will work out 3 or 4 years from now. They've got approximately 30,000 nuclear weapons. They have them deployed, depending upon the kinds of systems, various places in the Soviet Union. Right now, they remain under central control, but it's not clear yet how that will work out in the future in terms of negotiations between the center and the republics, or between the Russian Republic, where most of the strategic systems are, and the other outlying republics. We simply don't know how those issues will be resolved. I'm hopeful that they will be just as careful in the future as they have been in the past. But it's one of the great uncertainties about the future course of events inside the Soviet Union. While I am, like everyone else, enormously pleased with the developments we've seen over the last 3 weeks, the rise of communism inside the Soviet Union, there are a great many unanswered questions about the future, just one of which is who will control the nuclear stockpile in the Soviet Union.
Thank you.
Jim Norris, WSWR in Shelby. In light of all that's happened, how tough do you feel it's going to be for Fidel Castro to hold on to power in Cuba?
I think he's already in some difficulty. His economy is in terrible shape. We've seen large numbers of Cubans continue to flee Cuba for the United States before the Soviets carry through on statements they've already made about ending their subsidies to the Cuban economy. If they insist upon payment in hard currency for the oil that they previously provided, barter for sugar, if they withdraw Soviet military personnel and Soviet advisors, all of that will have an impact upon the stability of his regime. I can't predict exactly what will happen next or when it will happen, but it seems to me it's just a matter of time before Fidel Castro will have no choice but open up Cuba and subject himself to the same kinds of things that communist leaders all over the world have had to subject themselves to in the last 3 years.
Why has he been able to hold on for so long while others have not?
I think he's been able to hold on so long because he's on an island, because he has pretty tight control through the security services of his own situation on the island. It's not the kind of situation he had in Eastern Europe, where all of a sudden we started to have a massive outflow of refugees from Germany and elsewhere. Or the kind of situation where there have been free elections and the communist regimes have been overthrown. But I think even Fidel ultimately is going to have to submit to just the power of the idea of freedom and democracy. We'll have to give it up.
Mr. Secretary, Robin Meade from 250 in Mansfield. What is your reaction to the Philippine Senate action concerning the Subic Naval Base?
I think the apparent decision of the Senate, Philippine Senate, to reject the new base is a tragedy. The final decision has not yet been made. That is a decision, in effect, of the Committee of the Whole, that would indicate if all of the votes are cast the same way on the final day when the decision is made, it would indicate they will What it will mean is the end of nearly 100 years relationship between the United States military and the Philippines. It will mean that we will withdraw our remaining forces. We've already decided to withdraw from Clark Air Force Base because of the damage caused by the volcano. And now we'll find ourselves also having to withdraw the next year from Subic naval facilities. It will mean an end to the U.S. military presence in the Philippines. From the standpoint of the Philippine people, I think it's unfortunate because from as best we can tell from all the polls, the majority of the Filipino people actually support the continuation of the U.S. presence. Clearly will hurt economically. All the money that's pumped into the local economy by the presence of our forces there. The assistance package that we provided over the years, the proposal here was something in excess of $200 million a year that would have been provided and will not now be provided. And it's likely to have other consequences from the standpoint of developments in the Philippines. It's too bad. I wished it had come out some other fashion, but apparently the Philippine Senate is determined to reject the agreement. We didn't have no other choice without that agreement to withdraw our forces.
Mr. Secretary Elmore, it's WNC Radio TV 59 here in Ashland. In terms of the Philippines, what is the U.S. looking hard at this point as alternatives for base in that area of the Pacific?
Well, what we'll do is have to relocate our activities to other places in the Pacific. One of the things that we have in the Philippines that is very valuable is training space. We had, in conjunction with Clark Air Force Base, training ranges where we could fly our jets and drop ordnance, and do all of those things you need to do to maintain the presence of the military force. Some of that can be picked up elsewhere, perhaps in Alaska, for example, so it's already been done up there. The ship repair facilities in Yokosuka, in Japan, may be able to pick up some of the slack from what we've been doing at Subic in the past. Guam is not too distant U.S. territory. They may be able to provide some support and assistance. That is, we may be able to relocate some air base and a naval facility from Guam. We have the option of working out arrangements for joint exercises and periodic deployments with other nations in the region. So we'll take up the slack. It won't be the same kind of facility it's been now for more than 90 years in terms of our access to the Philippines. But we can do our job to find ways to patch around the loss. One more question.
Beth Church from the Philippine Agricultural Tribune. In regards to the Middle East Peace Conference next month, what do you see as the long-term effects that peace could bring in the Middle East?
I think many of us have hoped that the success of our policy in the Persian Gulf, the defeat of Saddam Hussein, the fact that we were able to work together with our Arab and Israeli friends during the course of that conflict, that all of this meant that the possibility of getting the Arabs and the Israelis together in a peace conference were greater than they've been previously. I think that's probably an accurate judgment. We're making progress now for the first time in my memory towards an actual peace conference where we indeed have the parties sit down around the table and talk face to face with one another. Jim Baker will be there shortly. When he leaves Moscow, Jim's going down to spend some more time on the subject. He's been there 4 or 5 times since March on this issue. We're hopeful that we can get a process started that ultimately would lead to a resolution of the historic conflict between Israel and her Arab neighbors. I don't think any of us underestimates the difficulty of that. It's not going to be easy. It's likely also to take a very long period of time, but it's a start. Now, when the United States has demonstrated conclusively our capacity to respond to support our friends when they're threatened, when we have, by virtue of our military action, eliminated the biggest threat to Israel in the region, and reassured our Arab friends that we will be deeply and actively involved in events in that part of the world, hopefully that will be a source of comfort and reassurance to the governments involved so that they'll be willing to take a chance for peace that previously they had. So, effort
States been successful because of the President's leadership. He's worked phones endlessly on the subject. Because of Jim's many trips to Europe, may be close to being able to convene these conferences. Thank you all very much.